these saints are so strong that they can get through everything. And then you realize, like, here's a woman that's like, just like can't even go, she has experienced an intense post-traumatic stress.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Crab at the Cross podcast. I'm your host, Mary Rose, and my guest today is author Patrick O'Hearn. We spend the majority of the interview discussing a book he's written on the parents of the saints. I think we've all met those seemingly perfect Catholic families. They always have a ton of kids right in a row. The kids are always really talented and really smart and really pious and probably also really attractive. And it's easy to look at families like that and think, wow, God must love them more. He must be blessing them, favoring them so much more than my family with all of our, problems and whatnot. And what Patrick's book really reveals is that often the opposite is the case, that the fertile grounds for holiness don't necessarily have these external versions of perfection. When you look at the lives of the saints and when you look at their parents, you see a lot of immense suffering. You see parents who've lost children, whether in miscarriage or in infancy or even later on in life. You see kids who've lost parents long before their time. You see disease, you see poverty, you see abandonment. You really see every kind of sorrow. And there's something almost consoling about that, to say, okay, this prosperity gospel version of holiness that says, if you have all this worldly success, you must be more blessed by God and you must maybe even be holier than other people, is really a false gospel. And so Patrick's book really subverts that kind of almost superficial version of holiness. The world's version of perfection is not God's version of perfection. The world's version of perfection is success and wealth and beauty and longevity. And God's version of perfection doesn't necessarily look like that at all. God's version of perfection is being poor in spirit and being merciful and being meek and being a peacemaker. And so this interview was definitely refreshing to hear how the saints actually lived, and how they were actually raised. So I hope you enjoyed this interview. Definitely check out Patrick's book. And if you are enjoying this podcast, please make sure you're subscribed in Apple Podcast or Spotify or Google Podcasts. Subscribe to me on YouTube to check out the video versions. Please leave a comment on YouTube or on Instagram. I'm also on Twitter at Crab and the Cross. And yeah, leave me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Okay, and now here's my conversation with Patrick O'Hearn. Patrick O'Hearn is an author and acquisitions editor at Tan Books. His subjects of interest include the lives of the saints and the interior life. His first book, Nursery of Heaven, Miscarriage, Stillbirth, and Infant Loss in the Lives of the Saints and Today's Parents, was released in 2019, and his second book, Parents of the Saints, The Hidden Heroes Behind Our Favorite Saints, was released in May 2021. His first children's book, The Shepherd at the Crib and the Cross, was released in October 2022. Patrick is also a husband and father and the founder of Contemplative Heart Press, which is meant to lead readers to a deeper union with God. It can be found at contemplativeheartpress.com. Patrick, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, thank you for having me, Mary Rose.
So I'm really intrigued by your work because you focus more on the parents of the saints, and that's definitely not something that is talked about very often. So what was your initial draw or attraction to looking at the parents of the saints rather than the saints themselves?
I think when God called me to the marriage vocation, that kind of opened up that spectrum to look at them. Because before that, I spent a couple of years in religious life, discerning, and then I always read the lives of the saints. And then after I discerned out of religious life, I had this disconnect between most of the saints. Like I just couldn't pick up the biography of St. Francis and read about him, it didn't strike me as much. Now in my younger days, when I was in college, I was eating that stuff up. But then after discerning out, I just felt like I want to read stories of people that are going to help me in my vocation. Not that I still read the lives of the saints, but I felt like, reading, how did these parents raise their children to become saints? That was kind of like, because I feel like the number one priority of parents should be not to get their children into an Ivy League school,
right?
But to get them to heaven. So that was kind of the inspiration behind it.
Yeah. So when you were in religious life and discerning religious life, were there particular saints that you had a special devotion to?
I did. I would say I loved, Saint Therese. I love Saint Martin de Porres, Saint Andre Bessette, and so those one, and then Solanus Casey, Blessed Solanus Casey. And so then actually in this book, they led me to their parents. So that's what was kind of ironic. I was devoted to them, and I felt like, why don't you write about my parents?
Huh. Was it hard to find resources and information about their parents?
It was, in the last century, there's more available information. Like Saint Teresa's parents, there's a lot written on them because their daughters wrote on them. But earlier saints, like you have to go through the biographies, even like Saint John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, just reading their biographies. But I would say, there's some saints like Saint Dominic's parents. There was only a few things on them.
Yeah. So. Yeah. And I would imagine too, like probably some of the more primary source material might also be in other languages and not necessarily translated into English. Did you run into that issue at all?
A little bit, even now I was praying, I'm like, should I do a sequel on this? Because there's just, I've uncovered through a friend who's a translator, there was a story about Pope Saint Celestine's, his mother was praying all night, and for one of their children that was going through, it was kind of having an illness, and so that was kind of just that persevering prayer. So
yeah, no, that's beautiful. Yeah, this past summer I got to go to Lisieux and see the house where Therese and her sisters were raised in, and it was interesting because I got to see that house, and then I also went to Lourdes and got to see the house where Saint Bernadette and her family lived, and they couldn't be more different. The Subarus were just like very poor. They lived in a mill, and then they lived in a jail cell at one point, and then the Martins had this beautiful kind of stately home with brick exterior and flower gardens and everything, and it was really interesting to see that you could have two amazing French saints, one that came from extreme poverty and one that came from not extreme wealth, but relatively well off, certainly, especially for that day.
Yeah, that is. I feature both of them in the, in my book, Bernadette's parents and then Saint Teresa's parents. And, it kind of shows you that, even that simplicity of heart, because even if, we have different spectrums. Some people grow up in a wealthy home and others being poor, but I think that it's that cultivation of virtue is really what they had in common. But definitely, I do think it's easier, the children that grow up with less, they can kind of have an easier transition to go to religious life because they've already been detached beforehand. As when you're wealthier, it becomes more challenging.
Right. Yeah. I've heard that with like certain religious orders, like the Missionaries of Charity. They have much more vocations from the countries that they serve. They have much less vocations from, the West, because it's just, their lifestyle, even compared to a lot of religious orders here, are even much more austere. And it's, I don't know. When I was reading about their life, like, they brush their teeth with ashes and things like that. It's like, I don't that's beyond just only having like a few simple possessions.
Yeah. So true.
Yeah. Well, one thing I've also noticed too with a lot of the saints is that several of them experienced the loss of a parent at a young age. Did you find that tended to have a strong effect on kind of the early life of the children who lost a parent?
I do. I think there's, one person I highlighted was St. Catherine Labouré, just very briefly, but I mentioned how when she lost her mother at a young age, I think her father said, Our Lady will now be your mother. And the same way we see with Saint Therese, John Paul II, I'm trying to think, there's Saint Jean Jugan, who founded the Little Sisters of the Poor. She lost her father at a young age. So I definitely think that, that suffering, like I look at certain saints even today, and it was those tough times that brought them together. I can't imagine, the person that John Paul II became was partly because he grew up in such, a difficult era, and then,
right.
Losing his mother. So I think suffering, leads to sainthood, or it can lead the opposite effect too. When I highlight a story about Margaret Sanger in there, and she came from a huge family, and she grew up around the same time as Saint Therese, and she was baptized Catholic. And you think about it, like, if same situation, but her father turned against God. But imagine if he hadn't done that. I mean, we could have had Margaret Sanger could have been a canonized saint, if they
right. Yeah, because I mean, she was certainly a motivated and in a way inspirational figure. I mean, she certainly was like very active and imagine what she could have done for good. Wow. Yeah, I think the same thing too with I think Joseph Stalin was like Catholic or maybe Orthodox, but he was in a seminary at some point. It's like, man, he really could have been the greatest saint, but instead he went the complete opposite direction.
Yeah, no, it shows you the importance of parents, and not that even good parents can have children that go astray, but
sure,
the majority of these, a lot of these people we see in our culture, the way they've gone off the deep end, it started with something at home, something with their parents' example.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too, because I think like in our culture today, there's a push to, make mother and father seem kind of interchangeable, and it it doesn't really matter whether or not you have a mom and a dad, single parent, whatever, same-sex couple. But even with like a lot of the saints, it's like, even though many of them lost a parent at a young age, like that's somehow still different from being completely deprived, from the beginning of having like a mom or a dad, and then obviously with our understanding of the intercession of the saints, it's like, well, you haven't completely lost this figure. Like in a way, they're able to assist you possibly even more.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, I think just even them having that absence, that they knew that, like Our Lady, and then they had obviously pointing to God the Father, those that lost, their own dads. So it was that supernatural faith. So I always say, that it made them long for heaven. And, that's where I think, the Catholic point of view is like detachment. When we experience suffering in our hearts, we're made for heaven. And I think that's where these parents, they kind of kept instilling that into their children. Like, this is not your home. We are pilgrims on earth.
Yeah. Did you find any parallels with like your own parents, your own upbringing, things that your parents did compared to some of these parents of saints?
Yeah, no, except that I'm not a saint.
no, but obviously, you dedicated your life, to the faith.
Yeah, no, I think there's some things I would say. Well, I mean, I'm more so. I mean, I love my parents. I dedicated the book to them, and they're very, good Catholics, and so I do think that there's a lot of good things that obviously that that I think the times when we would obviously say the Rosary together. So those were some important components, and but I think more so even than that, like I feel like these parents have kind of shaped my parenting a lot.
Really?
So
Yeah. How many kids do you have?
So we have 2 on earth and 2 in heaven.
Oh, how old are your children still living?
So my one son, he just turned 7, and then my daughter is 2 months old. So we have a huge gap in between there. So.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I'm sure the older one is probably so excited to have a sibling.
I read somewhere what John Paul said. He's like, the greatest gift you can give your children is to give them a sibling. So we've been praying, and that's why, again, that Nursery of Heaven book that I wrote, came out of a great suffering to write that book, to help other couples to know that, hey, you're not alone. People think when they get married that God's going to bless them with 10 or 15 kids, but a lot of the saints like John Paul II, his mother came from a big family, but she was only blessed with 3 children, and one of them died. It was within 16 hours of the childbirth.
Wow. Yeah. Well, even with Saint Therese, I didn't know this until I went to, they had a museum of her life, and her mother lost several children, either early on or as miscarriages. And I think the same thing too with Bernadette. And you just, for a lot of history, like it was just, there wasn't as good like maternal health care, and it was just more likely to lose a child, you know, in childbirth or at a young age. And, you know, now that we live in a time where, you know, it seems like that ought not to happen anymore because we have such advanced medical care, that it can be just such a shock for people that they don't really speak about, like that grief of miscarriage or even stillbirth.
Yeah, no, it tends to be. I think many people just keep it private, and then it just eats you away. And I think even like seeing Saint Zelie Martin, you know, they lost 4 children, and she was even at a point where she was visiting the cemetery. Her father had just passed away, and then she lost, you know, two of the boys they're pretty young. I mean, I think they were under the age of like a year and a half, maybe under a year, and then they had a 5-year-old girl, and then one that was died because their wet nurse turned out to, because she couldn't breastfeed, was an alcoholic, and so the child was neglected.
Oh,
and so,
my gosh.
you know, so that and she refused to walk down the same street where that lady was nursing her baby. And so, you know, there's just post-traumatic stress. So we often think like, man, these saints are so strong that they can get through everything. And then you realize like, here's a woman that's like, you know, just like can't even go, you know, she's experiencing intense post-traumatic stress.
Right. Yeah. And I think there's also like an unfortunate tendency to feel like, you know, if you have, I don't know, maybe a little bit of an easier life, like you have tons of kids, no trouble getting pregnant, you know, no health issues with the kids. Like it's easy to sort of feel like those people are more blessed by God, favored by God. You know, he loves them more because he takes care of them. And, you know, but when we look at so many of the saints, like they weren't the ones with the perfect lives. They did experience tremendous suffering. And I think it's important that we hold those figures up because, like, you know, they can help save us from that despair of feeling like, well, God hasn't given me X, so therefore, you know, he's rejected me.
So true. I mean, that's they say, right? Compare and you will despair. And I think too, like you can get inflated too when everything's like, look at me, I have, you know, everything's going well. I have, you know, you have to be really humble, even when you have these big families, because it can be, you can look down, you can see a family at church that has, maybe they don't have any children. You know, when I first started off being married, and I would see families with 1 or 2 kids, and it was a temptation. I wasn't like judging them, but I thought to myself, oh, maybe they love NFP a lot. Because you just don't know. Like, hey, maybe they're space. You know, a lot of people volunteer to me. Oh, you know, it's so, you know, like we're done after having 2 kids.
Sure.
But then after going through my own experiences, I realized sometimes people that have 0 kids in the pew, or maybe 1 or 2, like they could be more open to life than the family that has 6 or 7. Like they've never used NFP. You know.
Right.
So
no, I think that's like sort of the unfortunate side effect of, you know, the very strong stance against contraception, is that families who do struggle with infertility can feel like, and often very well be judged. You know, I've even heard of, this is awful, but I've even heard of like pastors, you know, calling out families, you know, in church and saying like, you need to stop using contraception. They're like, Father, we're trying everything we can to have a baby, you know, and it just kind of, I don't know, it just adds to the pain. It's like salt in the wounds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so true.
Yeah. So are there certain saints, you mentioned, you know, the parents of Saint Bernadette, the parents of Saint Therese, are there other like saintly couples that you particularly look up to, or that you found that you admired a lot, like in your research?
Yeah, there was one couple that I really liked, was Blessed Chiara Bandano. So she was a young girl, you know, born in, I want to say she was born in 1974, something around there, you know, from Italy. And her parents had prayed for 11 years to conceive, and finally they did. And then she, you know, grew up a normal childhood, and then she ended up getting bone cancer and then died, I want to say around the age of 18. And that really struck me, just, you know, even the father's suffering, because he, you know, just as we were talking about the theme of child loss, like he would look around and he goes, it was a great cross for me, because I would see all my friends having kids and we couldn't have any, but just that perseverance, like they would go to shrines and kept praying, and then they had the child, and then when when their daughter was when she passed away, the minute she passed away, they both got on their knees and they prayed like I think it was the Apostles' Creed, and and they were even their daughter at her final moments was getting assaulted by the devil, and the mother was standing by her and just kept praying with her. And I think we often think that it'll be our children that'll be at our bedside when we die. We hope, God willing, that they'll be praying the rosary for us, but sometimes God will call us to bury our own children and we'll be next to them. And so what does that look like? And I think that example of their perseverance and their prayer really spoke to me.
Yeah. So was she their only child?
Their only child.
Wow. Yeah. Now that this, not this past summer, but the summer before, I lost a friend, also the only daughter of her parents, same thing. Like they had been married since their early 20s and just miscarriage, infertility over and over again. I think her mom was like 40 when she finally had her, and then tragically she died in a car accident with her fiance. And I think like it's so hard for me to wrap my mind around something like that, because I know people who have just kids in the double digits, and all of them are fine. And then you think like, God, like why? Like, I mean, it sounds cruel to say like, well, if you have 14 kids, what's one less? Obviously that's not how it works for the mind of a parent, but to lose the only child, there's something that is just, I don't know. I mean, it's the unfathomable. I mean, it's what Our Lady went through ultimately, but it's that unfathomable mystery of the cross.
Just going to say the same thing about Our Lady, that was, I'm sorry to hear about your friend. Well, there's just no words for that. And even for the parents to go through that,
Right. Yeah. Did you look into any saints and then find out that their parents were just like really wretched people?
I did. I highlight one of them. She was just canonized, Saint Margaret of Castello. She, her parents, basically, because she was born, she had all these, I think, like spinal bifida. She had all these different issues, and eventually they went to pray. They had her like locked up in a tower, and where she would just go to mass. No one even see her. No one would see her. And then they're praying for a cure through this saint at the time, and they dropped her off there, and they basically left her after there was no cure, and so they abandoned her. And then she entered different orders, and even the religious orders took her in, but she was so holy that she was like pricking their conscience, so they kicked her out. But so she became like a third order Dominican, and it took her. She's like the patron of pro-life, and she was just canonized, I think, in the last couple of years. It took like 500 years. She's always been a blessed, but I think the fact is like her parents, they were kind of famous. They're noblemen, and like they wanted a son, and they got this daughter. And so it was just kind of just ironic that here she's making their name famous, even though like they wanted a child that would make them famous, and so she is, but not the way that they wanted it.
Right. Gosh, that's like almost like a modern, like a real life Hunchback of Notre Dame kind of situation. Wow. Yeah, I think probably a lot of people, they assume that there must be some kind of like very complicated or very difficult parenting strategy to create children that grow up to become saints. But like in your study, I mean, we mentioned like, the reality of suffering, but was there anything else that stood out that you're like, oh, this is exceptional? Or was it really just that common day-to-day fidelity to prayer, fidelity to mass? I mean, was there anything that really seemed out of the ordinary that these parents were doing?
Well, in my book, each chapter is arranged by hallmarks. So, and I found these hallmarks by studying the saints, because I would look at them and I would say, wow, they have this. And I'm like, I wonder if their parents have it. And so like, the first hallmark was a sacramental life. So I think that was the foundation. I mean, if you look at a lot of the saints, like even Saint Therese, from a young age, her father was taking her to visits to the Blessed Sacrament. Yeah. And then you had Saint Gemma's mother, every week she would take her children to confession. So I would say, definitely that was the most important thing, was a sacramental life. And then, have the sacrificial love. And I think, that was exemplified in Mother Teresa's own mother. Like she would be inviting the poor into her house. She would bathe this one lady that had sores all over her. So like Mother Teresa didn't like just automatically like, hey, I'm going to leave everything and go to no, like her mother was doing that.
Mm.
So I think that would be huge. I mean, like if a parent, the more that parents are sacrificing, especially not only in the home, but, even just the way they treat their neighbors, they're just constantly pouring themselves out, because you're not going to raise a saint if you're filled with pride and selfishness. You're not going to raise a saint. But if you're humble and you're sacrificial, and then I also have surrender, and that's the key too, is like, when difficulties come and trials, it's like, how is a parent, do they have a state of peace, when the world is going around them, or are they just living in anxiety? And then suffering was a huge one. So like suffering with joy. And then I had, so that you're asking me for one thing. So sorry, I'm giving you a couple.
No,
each chapter. And then I think another main one was solitude. Like these parents were like Saint Gabriel of Our Lady of Sorrows. He's one of my favorite saints, but his father would he'd pray an hour every day and in private prayer. So I think that they were definitely in touch with God. And then we had simplicity, just being detached from this world. And then the last one was like sacredness of life. So I wouldn't just say it's one thing. I think it's many things, but definitely the Eucharist, the Rosary, and then everything flowed from, I would say, charity, and then obviously, but prayer was definitely, these people they knew how to pray.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, I mean, you can't fake holiness, but you certainly can do things to give the appearance of being very pious. You can, like we said, if you have lots of kids, you can dress in a way that symbolizes like a, modesty or simplicity. You can show up at all of like the church events and whatnot, but like it really does come down to like a deep interior communion with God. Like that's what's going to pass on to the kids. Because unfortunately, I mean, I've seen this where you have kids who grow up in a very rigidly religious home, so they do the mass, they do the sacraments, they have the rules, blah, blah, blah. But when the kids get older, they completely rebel against it. And to me, that signifies, I mean, obviously we all have free will, but I think sometimes like people, like, kids are smart, like they can recognize maybe if their parents are kind of doing the externals, but they don't necessarily have the internal, the interior.
Yeah, I think there's a lightheartedness, and I see that with Saint Therese, the way she was raised up. Her parents are I'd say my spiritual heroes, Louis and Zélie, but they would Louis would often put Zélie, on his lap, and very affectionate, and then he would even do like music, like bugle sounds, like he just did a lot of fun things with their children. I think that's if your parents don't know that, just that quality time and knowing that you love them and giving, if all you're doing is just discipline, it's all justice. There's no love, because you have to think about it. Parents are meant to, to resemble the father, supposed to kind of imitate God the Father, to be that face of him. And I think I would say the key is, especially these homes, is because one, there's no joy in the home either. It's just a bunch of, we become Pharisees in a sense. All we do is follow. I mean, we need to follow, obey all the, the church commandment, all the commandments, everything the church teaches. But if there's no joy and no affection with your children, then you've basically, you haven't raised, your children will likely leave. I would think there's a good chance they'll leave the faith.
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, there has to be like you said, a joy, and I think also just a tenderness, a sense that like in the home, as much as their parents hold them to a very high standard, like there is like, if they make a mistake or if they do something wrong, like they know that their parents aren't going to just like, turn their back on them. Like you said, it can't be all discipline. There has to be that like merciful side, or else, that I think that rigidity just has the opposing effect.
So true.
Yeah. Did you notice any significant differences between parents of like some of the more contemporary saints versus parents of saints from, many centuries ago?
I think, I would say, I'm trying to look back at some of the older ones.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I noticed with the older ones, because, there's a lot of, it seemed like Teresa of Avila, like there was a lot of romance novels, and even with like Ignatius of Loyola, the way his parents raised him, it seemed like, they had these books of this. I would say they had a lot of books of the lives of the saints, but they also had like other stuff that they weren't really, I would say monitoring their children as much, perhaps. I mean, and back in the day there, and then I would say, I think, but then I think in the current times, I noticed one thing is like this also desire to move their children, almost like, we see this movement of homesteading, but as the culture got worse, I noticed that a lot of these saints, like Maximilian Kolbe's parents, they moved him away from the city to maybe a smaller town. And then Saint Therese's father, after his mother died, he asked the children, like, do you want to stay they were in Alençon, do you want to move to Lisieux? And the reason he wanted to move them is because there was more, it was more liberal environment. So that's why he moved them away from that. He asked the daughters, he wanted to move them, but he just wanted to make sure they were okay with it. So I think that element of just kind of slowly moving, protecting your children, it became even more important, especially with their friends.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's something that we often, that can be a missing factor. It's very easy to have everything kind of in order in your house, but of course your kids are going to go out, they're going to go to school, they're going to go see their friends, they're going to go to their friends' houses and everything. And it's like, you could have the perfect environment within your four walls of your home, but you have to kind of be on guard against the influences elsewhere. So like when you and your wife had kids, or maybe before you had kids, did you have certain conversations about like how you wanted to kind of structure, that the life with your children, or did it kind of flow like as you got to know your own kids?
Yeah, I think a lot of things, they changed, obviously when, before, we were, when we were engaged, and then in our first 7 months before my wife, conceived a child, we had this idea of how our parenting would be, but I think it evolves. And I think actually reading these saints really helped me, even with, like, I'll give you an example, like Saint Jose Maria Escriva, like his own father they'd go on walks together and they would just have that one-on-one time. So I think just a lot of nuggets that I picked up from my research, but it definitely, and I do ask, like, I always like to pick the brain of, holy parents that I know in my life. Like, what did you do? Like that, especially have vocations, and what did you? It's always, it's like, I think the minute you think you have it figured out, then you're kind of closed-minded. But you should, like, ask parents, like, even your parish priest, if he comes from a very holy family, like if you ever meet his mother, be like, is there anything that you kind of did? And a lot of times I did ask our parish priest that, and his mother said, my husband and I just had a really blessed marriage. Like, we love each other. And I think that, I think too, it's like sometimes you can focus so much on the kids. And I think there is, I think you can tell, like Lewis and Zelly Martin, they're writing love letters to each other. And there's a great love, there's a great love that I think that's the best. If anything, it's maybe not mentioned in my book, but I would say that these saints came from homes where their mom and dad loved each other. So.
Wow. It's beautiful that you highlight that, because I think there can be a tendency in some ways, like especially in Christian circles, to like, because marriage is clearly like kind of like the default vocation. It's like, all right, like, you don't just get to live like the bachelor life, like, lots of partners, like, you get married, you have kids, like that's what you're supposed to do. That sometimes the importance of having like a genuine affection that can kind of be like left out, sort of like, look for somebody who's virtuous, look for somebody who's holy, look for somebody who's Catholic, and just like marry them. And like, obviously those things are important, but you have to have that, like, I don't know, almost like subjective, just like affection.
Yeah. And even, I mentioned, a little bit like Saint Gianna's parents, and then even Gianna and her husband too, I think I highlight that in there as well. But it all flows from, like, you're building, that future vocation for your children. And just by the way, like the way I love my wife is like, I'm going to set my son, it's going to set up my son's future vocation. Just every day, maybe not even something that I say, he just sees me. I give my wife a kiss. He's like, wow, Dad really loves my mom. And no,
and I think like love just like spills over, it's not like it's not a limited resource, like when, like, the love that you show for your wife doesn't take away the love that you have for your son. And paradoxically, the love you show for your wife like kind of spills out like into the home and like flows to your son in some mysterious way.
Yeah, because I think, and I think it's more probably the tendency for women, for mothers to love their children almost more than their husband. I think it's easier for the husband to love his wife more, but I think the women, because they're around the children so much that it's like that's, and then when the kids move away, then the relationship, it's like it was all about the kids, and I think that's when you have to say like no, like the husband and wife, that relationship has to be the most important thing.
Right. I mean, I'm not married, so like I don't have like the exact personal experience, but I always wonder like, because people will use the language of like more, you should love your wife more than your kids, you should love your life, I don't know, I like there's something about that kind of like grates me, but at the same time it doesn't sound right to say you prioritize your spouse over the kids, or you prioritize your kids over the spouse. Like somehow it has to kind of all be like commingling together, but definitely, like I said, like love is not a limited resource. So whatever you're doing, it can't be sucking away from one to give to the other.
Yeah, I mean, they should build each other up.
Yeah. So before we wrap up here, I want to ask you though, that, I'm sure there's a lot of people listening who are trying to themselves live holy lives, but when they look back at their parents, they they might have had really difficult relationships with their parents. Maybe there's divorce, maybe there's addiction, maybe there's abuse even. And, what kind of advice or what kind of insights do you have for those people who don't have that like sort of nest of love and holiness that they were raised in, and might feel like, they're deprived?
I say, well, one is, that forgiveness, to say like, just like Jesus on the cross, like, Father, God, forgive my parents, and for, just, not letting not living a life of bitterness. And I also say this too, is like, all of us should be the parents that we always wanted to have. So it's like, just because you had that, and it is, I mean, all of us wish, like, I look at myself and I'm like, sometimes I do the things that like, I was like, I'll never do that when I'm a dad. Like, and I'm doing the same thing. And I think it's just like, let me not, like, I don't know, like I can only control what I can. I can't live in the past and what my parents did or not did. And it's painful. These wounds so forgiveness. And then I'd also say, just say like, Lord, help me to be the parents that I always wanted to have. And I think that changes your outlook. Like, the same with Saint Zelia Martin, like her own mother never showed her any affection. She wouldn't even give her a doll. And the fact, I think she even overcompensated over that. Like it almost changed her to even be more affectionate to Saint Therese. Cause if she modeled her motherhood after her own mother, there would be no Saint Therese. Like the way that Saint Therese loved was because, and granted her mother died when Saint Therese was 4 years old when she lost her mother. But I still feel like her and Louis, like that they just loved. And I think that's the key, is like not letting those wounds get to you.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. That's beautiful. Do you have any future books in the works right now?
I do. Yeah. So I have a book coming out in May called The Courtship of the Saints. It's called How the Saints Met Their Spouses.
Oh, that sounds really interesting.
So I highlight like 25 different saints and future saints. So, and that one's coming out with Tam Book. So I'd love to talk to you, but I'm big on like marriage stories. And originally it was going to have a lot of Couples Today story in there, but I think we got rid of those and focused on the saints. And, so
that sounds great, because I think that's another area where there's a huge struggle, even for devout practicing Catholics in our age today. It's like, we look at people from the past and it seemed like it was so easy, and we say, oh, it's so hard now, but that's just not an area that is really explored. But actually I remember reading I think it was the book that Joseph Ratzinger's brother wrote about their life, and I think that his mom and his dad met through like a personals ad in the newspaper, which I just love.
Actually featured, I have their story in my book.
Yeah, because like we want to like think like, oh, it's must be some kind of like super like romantic providential thing, and it's like, no, like someone put a personal dad out there, and then they gave birth to the future Pope.
I mean, God inspires us to do, some crazy things. And so you can't if you're just set in oh, I'm only going to meet my spouse if I go to this parish and, I go to this group. No, I mean, sometimes it's you have to really be open to the Holy Spirit. And I think ultimately it's, I always say to it that, our most important thing is falling in love with God and seeing what happens after that, and I was going back and forth on the issue of a soulmate. I think it's, so Tolkien has he always said the soulmate is the one you're married to. It's anyways, I think I just wanted to tell the stories and basically just to help people prepare for marriage. And so anyway, that one's coming out, God willing, I think end of May.
Okay. Oh, wow. Definitely would love to talk to you about that when it comes out. But yeah, that sounds like a really good, but also I think needed book for today's Catholics. So, well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me, Patrick. I hope a lot of people check out your books. Are you on social media or anything like that, or do you have?
I'm not.
Okay, good for you.
I have a LinkedIn profile.
Okay.
I post stuff from TAN, so if anyone,
okay,
I just post our books on there and some of my books. Great. And in the Parents of the Saints one is available at tanbooks.com, and then I think the Nursery of Heaven's on Amazon.
Okay, beautiful. Alrighty. Well, thank you so much, Patrick.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm sorry, I was fumbling over my words because my boss, it's he starts calling me and it can't, and I don't know how to put do not, I don't know how to, maybe in the future. So I saw his message and then he starts texting me. And so no. I'm just
oh, and there, I don't know if you heard that.
Yeah, that's okay.
Come here, bud. We don't need to be bad, okay?